Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second edition of our virtual AI&I talk. I'm Inga Paus, and I run the Vodafone Institute, which is the think tank, the European think tank for the Vodafone Group. And normally we host the AI&I Salon, how we call it, a regular talk with digital masterminds here in Berlin. But in light of Corona, we decided to virtualize it to keep us all safe and healthy. Today, we are happy to host a very special guest, Professor Luciano Floridi, the director of the Digital Ethics Lab at the Oxford Internet Institute. And in fact, this is a reunion as we kicked off our first AI&I Salon series 2 years ago with Luciano, with a fabulous evening event on the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. But I leave it to our AI&I host, Alexander Görlach, to introduce you properly to Luciano Floridi and the topic of today's AI&I virtual talk. Alexander is joining us from New York this afternoon. He is a senior fellow of the Carnegie Council of Ethics in International Affairs and served in various positions at the Harvard University. Alex, please take over and run us through our second AI&I virtual talk.
Thank you very much, dear Inga, for this kind introduction. It's great to be back, albeit digitally. It's great to be back with Luciano, who, as you mentioned, he and I have already some AI&I history with the Vodafone Institute, and it's great to check in together again. Luciano is a professor of philosophy and ethics of information at the University of Oxford. He's the director of the Digital Ethics Lab of the Oxford Institute, also at the University of Oxford, and a Turing Fellow and a chair of the Data Ethics Group at the Alan Turing Institute. And today's topic is of course, in the light of the Corona crisis and the COVID pandemic, we want to discuss about the new technologies and how they can help us combating the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the recent past, there has been lots of talk about tracking apps, which in one way or the other should be helping and assisting us in combating this crisis. Having said that, however, this would have, depending on what kind of app you create, some severe ethical implications, and about these implications we are about to talk. And I'm happy to give Luciano the floor. He has a presentation for us on which grounds we then afterwards will be discussing. It's first Luciano and I for a few questions, but we encourage you all, as soon as you have a question, just shoot it, and we will be trying to implement all of them in our conversation to get you guys engaged in this salon as well. But now, Luciano, we are all eager to hear your presentation.
Thank you, and hello everybody online. I'd like to thank Alexander for the kind introduction here and the Vodafone Institute for this opportunity. And I would like to make just one point clear before we start. Whatever I say, I'm saying it as an individual, as a professor from Oxford, not in any other sort of role or responsibility. I'm saying this because I am a member of the Ethics Advisory Board set up by the NHS, the National Health Service in England, to advise on the development of the coronavirus app. So all I'm saying is, in terms of my own role as an expert, say from Oxford, not as a member of the board, of course, and my views do not represent views of the board, one way or another. I hope they might agree with them. So the presentation will not be very long, and I have these few slides, and I will walk you through them rather quickly. The point is quite clear. We are undergoing a terrible pandemic, and there is a possibility that some technology, an app, may help us to develop tools that can support our sort of strategy against the virus. What you read there on the screen is a standard definition of what an app looks like. It's a mobile software application, in this case for contact tracing, so that we know with whom we have been in contact, if anyone of the people we've been in contact with or ourselves end up by being unwell, then we can take measures. For example, we can spend time at home or go and see a doctor. The first question already important is the app, this particular piece of technology, useful to reduce the number of infected cases, to flatten the curve, as we say, so for phase 1, or, but it's also is to end the lockdown, to return to normality? Is it something that we need now, tomorrow, or even further down the road for the next possible risk we're going to run? Well, because the technology is, as we know, quite sophisticated, there have been a number of different approaches. The one I present to you here are the ones under discussion in Europe. And I mean Europe, not European Union, because they're also being discussed in the UK and other countries that do not belong to the EU. On the one hand, you have that funny sort of shortcuts, PPPT, which is essentially the initial step taken at the European level to develop these apps in a centralized way. After that, for reasons that I will explain in a moment, we started looking at more privacy-preserving apps, which for short we'll call decentralized. So the discussion has become, and here I give you a very quick overview, a graphics that is a bit simplistic, I'm afraid, but should give you the idea. On the left, you have a centralized system. Mobile phones get in touch with each other through the app, but the data have to be collected by a central system. Someone has to manage the central system, NHS in our case in England, and is the central system that then sends information to the other particular users. There's more you can do with the data collected, of course, but at the same time, some of the risks are more obvious. On the right, you have a way more decentralized system that requires a minimal amount, literally just almost nothing, to be shared of and above my mobile, your mobile. Everything happens at the mobile phone level, and therefore some of the risks are minimized. I'll tell you more about it in a moment. At the same time, some of the useful things that you can do with the data, of course, are no longer available. You don't have a centralized deposit. You cannot run, for example, data analytics on their centralized deposits, not so easily. Now, why is this a problem? And I'm going to show you now a slide which is also quite simple. Now, imagine you are an expert who has to decide, which app do I use? The one that is centralized or the one that is decentralized? Well, you have different, on the column on the left, different important points. It has to be legally acceptable, so GDPR and everything else has to be taken into account. It has to be medically useful, and so if it doesn't help, well, surely we're wasting our time. It has to be technically reliable. Imagine you build something that breaks down every now and then, Bluetooth doesn't quite work, the app doesn't make sense, is not compatible with other pieces of software, and so on. It has to be socially preferable. People must download this app willfully. They have to be happy to do it. They volunteer, and therefore the uptake has to be easy, friendly. Imagine queues of people wanting to do it. And it has to be epidemiologically useful, perhaps, maybe for further studies, maybe to know more next time we have a pandemic. Now, those columns come with different degrees, from unimportant, you couldn't care less, all the way to absolutely critical. I gave you there an example. Maybe you want to slide legally acceptable all the way to critical. If it is not legally acceptable, sorry, you can't do it. Medically useful, well, that's important, of course. Is it absolutely critical? Some people would say yes. Some other people would say, well, if it doesn't work, at least it doesn't do any harm. You can see what other options may be there. Now, why is this a difficulty? Well, because, okay, well, certainly a group of experts could come to some agreement on these values of those columns, and the columns might be many more. Those are 5 of the most obvious. But imagine the expert, and now I show you another slide, on that. Experts disagree on 2 things. First of all, disagree on the trade-offs. Which values you put on the long column? Is it, for example, socially preferable, absolutely essential, or is it not? Or, as we have, for example, in the UK, further studies epidemiologically useful, well, maybe it doesn't have to be. maybe all we have is right now an app that saves lives as we speak, and we cannot afford to have something even better for the future. Maybe, maybe not. So experts disagree. So they disagree on the column, and they disagree on the row. Some people will say, well, maybe epidemiologically useful, it's great, but it's only highly desirable. Some will say absolutely critical. There is the disagreement about the trade-offs. Now, next step. Imagine that we even agree on the trade-offs. The disagreement now can be about how you deliver those trade-offs. Is the yellow app better than the red app? The distributed better than the centralized because of the trade-offs you have imagined. So at this point, it looks like there is a lot of confusion, and that's why we're having a big debate. What is happening in real life? Now, let me show you what the details are in terms of Europe. We know that France, Germany, Italy, NHS England, and others had supported the centralized solution. At some point, Apple and Google decided to provide an API, essentially an interface, to make whatever app you desire work better on Google mobile phones. They sort of operating systems, Android and ISO. So iOS, and at that point, some countries decided to change direction. Italy and Germany have changed their approach, and they have opted for a decentralized approach, which is more compatible with the Apple-Google API, and therefore is supposed to work better, more easily, and facilitate, therefore, the uptake, how many people are going to download it. First consideration, it's quite strange, but what we're looking at is companies like Apple and Google changing government's behavior. This is a fact. It's a fact that we need to come to terms with. We may or may not like it, but a fact remains a fact. There's also a bit of irony here. Apple and Google seem to defend privacy more than governments. Why? Well, because governments, for example, they look at the future. They want to have epidemiological studies and therefore centralized data, whereas Apple and Google care more about making sure that it is very difficult to infringe the privacy of anyone if the data are not collected anywhere and they stay on your mobile phone. So we're looking at a variety of different changes in power once again. And if you I mean, a philosophical point, we have a specific case in the coronavirus app of a more general trend of where power, not only political, but the power to influence decisions around the world is being reallocated as we speak. Suppose we want to make then some sense of that trade-off. One fundamental point that I've learned in the past 6 months is that no trade-off is possibly resolvable unless you tell me what for. Imagine someone says, look, we will use the minimal amount of data necessary. That sounds good. Unless then you wonder, necessary for what? Because if it's necessary for just phase one, contact, etc., is a kind of data that the decentralized app can perfectly support. If it's necessary for epidemiological studies in the future, then you need a centralized database, and it's a pretty different amount of data. So the what for. But what I show you there is the reasoning that I have also quite publicly been supporting, and in my view should drive the decision about the trade-offs between the different apps. Not now only, but also in the future. Well, you want to have as much privacy as possible, transparency in what is going on, and a robust technological, robust thing. Only if you have that, then you have more trust in the population. And only if you have more trust, then you have more uptake, a lot of people using the app, which means that with more uptake, you have more effectiveness. And with more effectiveness, less social injustice between those who can afford the kind of mobile phones required or the contract of those mobile phones, the skills to learn how to use these apps, etc. So what you see there is a simple reasoning of the following format. What is the most important thing we want to achieve with this app? To me, is effectiveness. And for effectiveness to be there, you need a lot of people downloading it. To get a lot of downloads, you need a lot of trust. And a lot of trust is better supported by a decentralized app, as we have seen in Germany, in Italy, in other countries, and the one supported by Apple, Google API. When I say a lot of people, you may wonder, what percentage? Talking 5, 10% of the population? Unfortunately not. We're talking about a lot of people. Different studies reach different conclusions, and I've read by now, because of my role with the advisory board, more than I can want to remember and possibly tell you. But there is a general consensus that below 20% of the population, the app is entirely useless. It's like drinking water to fight the coronavirus. Useless. It starts getting really useful anything between 50 and 60% of the population. Some people speak even of 80%. Now, imagine that we accept 50, 60. In fact, the European analysis reaches 60% of the population. In the UK, that means, the whole Great Britain, means 0% of mobile phone owners, because of course, there's a bit of a population that doesn't have the technology. Now, remember also that in the UK, in particular, the digital divide is quite serious. We have many millions of people who are on the wrong side of the digital, don't have the knowledge or the skills to use the technology. At that point, you realize the uptake is a challenge, and therefore, as much as trust as possible is a requirement. Once again, that's why a distributed solution might be preferable. It's not the best, but it's the one that works better. A general point about this, as I said, is now that we look from a more philosophical perspective, is, are we talking about the control of technology by someone? Remember how governments have changed necessarily their policies by having a different kind of technology available, or technology's control of someone? Remember, is it technology that is controlling us, or we are controlling technology? Of course, we should be in control, obviously. Forces of other kinds should not be allowed. But then this control comes inevitably with a sense of accountability. Who controls? The ones who control other people. Now, in democracy, and I cracked that joke in a bit of Latin because I think that it's quite common. You find it even on Wikipedia. The phrase is, who takes care of those who take care? Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? And it seems to be a paradox. Well, you have controllers of controllers of controllers. The truth is that you go all the way back to those who are controlled. In a democracy, it is the controlled that controls the controllers. And if it sounds too much of a mouthful, just remember, those who control other people are controlled precisely by those who are being controlled. We, the people, as the American Constitution will say, are the controllers of the controllers. That's why this should be a discussion that involves democracy at its very core. Now, to control technology, you can do several things. You can use the market, you can use the law, you can use ethics. I'm showing you an example of an article that we are publishing with my research group in Oxford on ethical guidelines to understand and evaluate tracing and tracking systems. Now, what exactly is the ethical debate here? I leave the market and law to other experts. Well, the control of technology when it comes to ethics makes use of fundamental steps that are well known to engineers. You need to verify that you're building the right solution, and then you need to validate that whatever the right solution is, you are building it in the right way. So building the right thing first, yes, no, and building it rightly, yes or no. Well, in this case, verification concerns things like, is this app necessary? Well, we think it is. Is it proportionate? Well, again, the version that minimizes data and is distributed seems to be more proportionate than the centralized and the accumulates data. Is it scientifically sound? Yes, we hope so. And is it temporary? Oh, definitely has to be. We need to be told when it starts, but also when it ends collecting data. Now, if all this is in place, then privacy is a major, major problem that is no longer impossible to solve. Data authorities all over the place, Europe included, consider that the technology that we have available, this Bluetooth distributed mobile phone to mobile phone, you to me, minimization of data, no collection, only contact, not location or when it happened, only not where it happened, not by whom, all that in place means that privacy is an important problem that we are able to solve. What remains in place is the efficacy and the social justice. The efficacy, I already mentioned it, but here are some data. In 2017, the data that are more recent available, 43% of the EU population had an insufficient level of digital skills. 17% had none at all. So they did not use the internet or barely did so, meaning that they were unable to do a search on Google, download a picture. Now, that is an enormous amount of people, and it's a segment that runs the risk of being excluded. That's why the uptake has to be so wide and so facilitated. What's the problem with the lack of efficacy, social justice? I like to stress this because a lot of people don't seem to be sufficiently worried about it. I heard the following reasoning all over the place. We need a lot of people downloading this app. To do that, we need to have incentives. Incentives means, for example, you can go back to work, you can socialize, you can take public transports, you can go shopping, etc. Now, that kind of incentive, internal incentives, will transform the population. Just look at the percentage of people who don't have a mobile phone or cannot use the mobile phone into first-class, second-class citizens. I might be a first-class citizen because I have the latest technology, I know how to use it, I know how to handle it. Someone else next to me may not for his own fault or her own limits, but because she cannot afford it, she doesn't have the skills, etc. That's not a solution. That's not a good idea. So I have recommended all over the place to anyone, if you need to have incentives, make them external, irresponsive, irrespective of whether you are rich or poor, you know how to use it or not. For example, and this is almost like a joke, but not quite, imagine a lottery ticket. You link a lottery to the ownership of a mobile phone and an app. It doesn't mean that I'm a first-class citizen or a second-class citizen. It means that I'm just lucky or not lucky. But you can go to work or not, you can socialize or not, independently of whether you do have the right hardware, the right software, the right skills, because that would be socially not just, unjust. There are lots of other risks, of course, and we're coming to an end of my quick presentation. If this app doesn't work, it may be just a political solution. You just show that you're doing something. Doing something becomes the goal. There is no real sense of success apart from showing that you did what you could. You cannot be blamed for not trying. A bad app, an app that doesn't work or it's badly designed, will be a waste of money, positive cost, a distraction, an opportunity cost. We will have spent an enormous amount of social capital, political capital, time, even this seminar, for example, this meeting with us, distracted by something that in the end we could have done something different, opportunity cost. And it could undermine future technological possibilities. That would be horrible. If this doesn't work, it does not mean that something else tomorrow better may not work. And it might actually exacerbate the digital divide. That is something that we definitely need to be careful about. So coming to an end, and that is really among the most last slides that I want to present, a few things that I've learned by this recent experience with the app. If anyone had any doubt, technology is never ethically neutral. It's always loaded. And the game that involves legal aspects, technological aspects, social, ethical aspects, political aspects, you cannot separate them. Assuming trust, whenever designing, developing, deploying technology as a default position, they will trust me, of course. What else would they do? It's not a strategy. Trust must be earned, cannot be put at the beginning as a default position. Public debates. where they can undermine trust if run badly. If you see a lot of experts bickering with each other and in the worst possible way, the public will simply be uncertain and will be reluctant to adopt any solution, one or the other. If I were the public for something I don't understand, well, what would I do? Simply be reluctant, wait for tomorrow. Don't do, better safe than sorry. We need to make sure that the power between private and public is balanced. And if we cannot do this now because it's too late, let's make sure that we do this tomorrow when we'll come out of this crisis and consider who decided what, when, and whether society should be able to have more of a saying when it comes to these fundamental, vital technologies. The morphology of power is changing. For another talk, is becoming the morphology of uncertainty. Those who control the questions shape the answer, and those who shape the answer actually decide about reality. So uncertainty is everything even more today, and those who have the means to control it are ending up being really the decision makers. We should make sure that society there is in a decisional position. And finally, the challenger is clearly no longer digital innovation, but it's the good governance of the digital. I've said this more than once, and I'm sorry for those of you who have already heard me saying it, but clearly that is the challenge we have for tomorrow. Coming to an end, the future, what it looks like, and let's step back from the app and the debate, centralized, decentralized, Apple, Google, Germany, Italy, UK, etc. Well, if I were to look at, say, the day after tomorrow, I think I would like to see technological solutions, political decisions, policy making, ethical considerations, moving from empowering to enabling. Empowering has become a bit of a trick to shift responsibility. If I empower you and something doesn't work, something goes wrong, is your problem. What we want to have, actually, with technology is more enabling. I want to allow you to have more options, but not the idea that something is essentially on your shoulders. And companies could be third parties competing to support users, consumers, and so on. The future will have passed the threshold. We're not coming back. There will be different depths of transformation, but also multiple directions of transformations. And for that, I hope we'll have a Q&A to make it a little bit less superficial of what I had time to explore. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for being cut out somehow. Luciano, thanks again for your presentation. And let's just jump to the first question. Obviously, this whole debate about tracking apps and surveillance and government infringement or infringement of companies, for that matter, has led to a reloading of the debate between the efficiency of systems, the democratic system versus the autocratic system. How do you perceive this whole debate, like in the light of the light of the discussions we now have? Discussion now in regard to this systemic battle, if you will, between free societies and autocratic societies.
Yes, you're right, and this has created a bit of a tension, which I think is not reasonable, but apparent in especially mass media between, shall we say, freedom and safety, or democracy and emergency. I think that the way out of this tension is by adding more ingredients, so to speak. If you have the whole picture as if it were just a matter of, say, either we protect freedom or we protect safety, and you don't have the extra element of control, then it's almost impossible to resolve it. But suppose we also talk about who controls what. Now, in a good, decent democracy, this process should be controlled, debated openly, publicly, transparently, potentially involving also the parliament, as I know is going to happen in France, for example. And that would represent a way in which the whole community comes together and decides together what kind of sacrifice needs to be done by all of us. Now, you can ask everybody to make a sacrifice for a certain amount of time for good reasons. We have all done it. No, imagine just being on diet. In this case, locking ourselves in our houses to protect other people. Totally doable. It's a sacrifice that can be asked. The question is, who controls the asking? And if it is in a non-democratic way, in which top-down, some, say, dictator somewhere in the corner decides you have to do that, well, that is exactly the problem we have now, because you can do this today, tomorrow, and again and again. It will be just a slippery slope, and we've seen this in some countries. Now, in decent democracies, this, on the other hand, goes back to popular consensus. Are we all together in this? And that seems to me a way of reinforcing democracy, showing that democracy can take it, can even have a way of making sacrifices that are part of our demos, our way of living together. So it could be a show of strength by good democracy, or in other contexts, polarization, evidence of how some democracies are not democratic after all, and they're not that good in handling tough decisions when popular consensus is required.
And we also saw in terms of the lockdowns all around the globe in democracies, let's say for the first 6 or 8 weeks, people were like saying, okay, we get it, it's an infringement, but we're about to do it. And now after 2 months, we also hear New York are in week 9 now, you see like discussions arising, which I think is actually a good thing to just say, okay, wait, politics, we gave you these 8 weeks, but now let's make an assessment. What are going to be the next steps, and what is the success we have, and should we continue with this kind of lockdown in the future?
Yes, I think that the important thing here is to also understand another corner of this debate, which I said it's been a litmus test for our way of doing politics today, which is the role of science, the role of scientific experts. Now, when do you listen, and how far do you listen to the experts? And which experts? We know that people disagree. I mean, in moments of uncertainty, science turns out to be exactly what people in academia know perfectly well. It's a human endeavor, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Inevitably, it's a good way of doing something about the advancement of knowledge. In moment of crisis, of emergency, you have the problem of deciding, okay, how far do we want to make sure that this bit of science rather than that bit of science is relevant and significant. Now, in terms of the phase 2, which we have seen starting in different countries with different degrees of success, or actually lack of success, I think we are, I'm afraid, privileging one science rather than another, economics rather than epidemiology and biology. I think the lessons from the past teach us that this is a long-term fight, that a month of lockdown or even 2 very painful, but may be really not enough. And so how far do we want to go? Well, I would personally be very cautious. Being very cautious means having the socio-political will of spending money to support those who, contrary to the privilege, have more to sacrifice, more to lose by being further into a quarantine, a moment of lockdown. So I'm aware of the cost, and the cost should be socially paid by all of us. I'm happy to go public. Tax me more tomorrow. But do we privilege the economy of a country over the health of the population? I mean, that is something that seems to me, even asking the question, insane.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, you highlighted this now in your answer, but also before in your presentation. It seems to be like a paradox or an aphorism. Like on one hand side, you have already divide in society, obviously, socioeconomically and whatnot, and that also leads to different health situations for different groups in society. And now with the app, it's even like tending to ample these social divides, which you could only meet by making an app like this like mandatory, or like giving out the devices on which these apps are. Or think of, as you said, of another device in general, but still, this would then mean like the government is like, or the state is just like, I wouldn't use the word infringing, but it's like offering in a way, or making it mandatory, or then it becomes compulsory mandatory. So I feel this is an aphorism that I don't know how we could tackle this. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I have maybe a comment. Consider the following. Imagine that this app works only with the latest version, the most expensive, the one that requires the highest degree of skills, and consider at the same time that you make it compulsory. All of a sudden, it will be, I'm oversimplifying, forgive me, it will be the rich helping the poor. You will be asking the rich, oversimplifying, it's not black and white, of course, but the privileged side of the digital divide to do something compulsory in order so that the whole society, those on the wrong side of the digital divide, could be helped as well. Now, this is how paradoxical the situation has become. So don't give incentives to those who are already privileged. Give them an obligation to support those who are not privileged. Now, that seems to me an interesting way of looking at all this. The bottom line remains that we have transformed this app in some corners, and I've read newspapers saying that, and politicians actually stating this publicly as essential to fight the virus. It is not. It's a small component of a much bigger strategy, and the biggest strategy is medical and social. So if we could just reduce the importance of this app to what it is, an extra help if it works, when it works, because the real debate, the real fight will happen at the biomedical, epidemiological, and sociopolitical stage, not in a technological implemented way. Then it will be much better off. Unfortunately, we have overemphasized the value of these apps, and all of a sudden we are in this narrative. Now, you were remarking about the small uptake in Singapore. I mean, the last data that we have, they speak of 20% of the population, meaning below the threshold of useless. Now, that is something that we want to consider. So maybe it is not entirely useless. Maybe there's something to be gained. Maybe the data will help in the future, etc. But with respect to finding a cure, finding a vaccine, the lockdown, social measures, even washing your hands and covering your mouth, it's incomparable. So if you want me to comment on this, I would say, important, why not? Let's try, but let's not overemphasize this as a panacea. It is not in any possible sense.
Especially when you talk about like how, let's say, the well-off or better off would be like responsible to somehow, or made responsible or incentivized to help the other compartment of society. It sounds a little to me like a trickle-down approach, which we know from other contexts is not really working. So to just depend on, in that sense, on the goodwill doesn't seem feasible to me. But like talking about like other digital measures or technological measures, aside from the tracking app, which I understood now has severe downsides, what are alternative measures that we could be taking on with the help of data algorithms, like to say all the buzzwords? Because clearly in the debate about the system combat between free societies and autocratic societies, I think it stays a fact that both run on data, and that our society, wherever we are on this planet, and also then what it means to deliver good governance, is not to be thinkable without outside a framework of data. So what else do we have other than a tracking app to help us?
Yeah, well, there's I'm glad you're asking that because there's a whole universe out there that we are partly exploiting, partly not exploiting, and we should. Let me mention just 2 or 3 things quickly. The amount of data that we are collecting and we need to collect, make sure that, for example, we capture at the very, very beginning a second wave of this coronavirus, if it's going to happen, where it might happen, and we intervene immediately. That's crucial. Having said that, the UK knew that the coronavirus was coming. It knew weeks in advance. It could see what was happening in Italy, in France, in Germany, and it acted too late. United States, same story. So sometimes the information, the data are there. The technology is available for data analysis, for data science of the highest possible quality and caliber, and we are not exploiting it. That is not acceptable. Or imagine what we could do in order to exploit the data and to find a cure by means of new machine learning algorithms. I know this is already happening. You just have to check the ordinary press. I would expect there technology giving a big hand. Once again, we are reminded of something, I'm afraid, no. One of the people who have been saying this for a long while, it's a tool. It's a means in our hands. AI, artificial intelligence in general, for example, for biological discoveries, in support of a fast, successful vaccine. What are we learning there? That what you and I have been discussing only in the past 2 or 3 years, AI, remember, AI is the greatest possible risk humanity is ever facing? Seriously. We knew better. It was obvious to anyone apart from the mass media and people who produce Tesla. That is not a serious way of using science, but AI could help a lot. Or, last point, imagine, and it's already happening, a lot of good technology at as I was, for example, screen, anytime I was going to it, technology that can facilitate, expedite screening, testing, anywhere, so that we know more about who might or might not be infected and take care of it preventively and so on. But that's a big role that technology could play. I would like to see more investments along those lines. The app, I have the impression sometimes it's a bit of a distraction.
And I also like when you stress like the point that the decentralized, the more, let's say, tech savvy and protective of our civic liberties sort of approach is more fostered now by the big tech companies, whereas you would think like from their conduct in the past and from their business models, they might be more inclined to collect as much data as possible on their end, so they would be like be more inclined to also favor a centralized option. So what do you make of this like antagonism between corporates and governments?
It's a funny moment, really, but it reminds us that we, as it were, the people in the middle, we should distrust, as it were, or play the two one against each other. I find very funny when people say, "Oh, I trust the government, but I don't trust the large corporate companies." I say, seriously, in Europe, do you remember what happened 75 years ago when we trusted governments? Vice versa. No, say, "Oh, I never trust, but I trust the big companies." Cambridge Analytica, anyone? So I think the best thing to do is to have a competition between these major forces out there and make sure that they serve the widest possible good for the society that otherwise is going to pay one way or another. So if today it is convenient to see Apple and Google remind governments that data collection needs to be minimized, well, it's ironic, but I don't mind. I just hope that tomorrow governments, once we come out of this, will remind Apple and Google that minimization is also something that they should apply when is a different kind of game. So let's make sure that they play against each other, but not with us in the middle, as it were. At the moment, I feel that we are between a rock and a hard place, as they say in English. We should make sure that the hard place and the rock play against each other, and we are on the beneficial side. Now, in terms of the distributed, non-distributed, decentralized, not centralized, it seems to me that the following reasoning, I have the impression, is more convincing than any other. A centralized mechanism would be preferable if a lot of conditions were satisfied. Security, privacy, trust, uptake, etc. Those conditions are unlikely to be satisfied. So I don't mind that that is better than something else. Is, as we say also in Italian and in English, I don't know whether that is also true in German, It's a classic better enemy of good. So I'd rather have good than better. And good is a decentralized option that makes some risks and some bad opportunities not available. So you don't have the problem of solving something that otherwise you would have if you had a centralized option. Having said all this, whatever solution we will find in any country, remember, it will be legally okay. So it is not a question of is it legally compliant or not. It really is a question of, is it ethically preferable? Is that what we would like to see happening, as opposed to, okay, we can live with it?
Das Bessere ist des guten Feind, as we say in
There
German.
you go.
It also exists in German.
It's common wisdom all over the world. When people try to get a little bit more, oh, can I have an extra? And you say, look, if you push it too hard, it will break the whole thing. So, but it's so much better. Wishful thinking, not a strategy.
Yeah. Let me move to the questions of the people here. Like there's Susanne Steigler asked, dear Professor Floridi, how can risk groups, especially elderly people, be reached who are impacted by the digital divide as well?
So I discussed this as an option. Actually, I proposed this to a government. Let me be generic, not to the UK, and it didn't go anywhere. But I suggested that we could have apps for family groups. You could have, at the moment, the apps we are developing are individual. My app, your app, so on, Bluetooth, etc. I would like someone to start thinking in terms of, look, I have my parents at home, they're elderly, they would like to go to the park, they are in their 70s, they're not going to handle this, and so on. Or I have 3 children, they don't have mobile phones. Now, is anyone thinking about the real life here? We are just thinking about the average, sort of Facebook user in his 20s or 30s. That's not your average population. So imagine a family related or socially friendly app on which I can use, for example, a little bit of things that I attach to a key holder. And I have a mobile phone in which I control several little gadgets that I give to my dad, my mom, my 2 kids. My wife has the app that controls everything. She's much better than me with these things. So bingo, that could be a possibility, but it requires time, thinking, strategy, long-term intentions. I would like that to happen now for the next pandemic problem, because they are coming in waves. This is not the last one, and the next one, we should be prepared.
Thank you. Lasse Kosup asks, dear Mr. Floridi, if you could build an app free from external influences, how would your model of a tracing app look like?
I think it would look like very much the family thing that I just said, zero incentive, potentially centralized with a big database, which would enable us, ideally, to extract so much more information, also in terms of people meeting other people, something that with a one-to-one difficult. Now, I'm not contradicting myself. I hope that the reasoning is quite straightforward. I'm not talking about the best possible solution in an ideal world. I'm saying, unfortunately, we don't live in that ideal world, and that ideal solution will not make a difference in this real world.
A user by the name Petrol asks, this is an extremely interesting debate, thank you. What is your view on less than perfect democracies and the perils of using this type of benefit for other purposes? A benefit in Virgolette.
Well, it is a slippery slope. That's why we live in a world that is not ideal, and therefore where ideal could be very dangerous. Can you imagine a centralized app in the hands of the wrong kind of government? And we have some in Europe widely understood. Are you sure they're not going to use it for different purposes? Well, I wouldn't be so relaxed. So the problem that the question is raising is a fundamental problem that we have had forever in our civilization, but it's more pressing today than in the past. Trust. Whom do I trust? With my data, with the technology?
Sorry. So that's, I think we two spoke about this at another occasion, about trust as the currency. I feel even on the panel in Berlin 2 years ago, and it's a recurring topic, because and obviously now you mentioned like experts, and then like experts are not taken serious. There's like a random dude or less coming saying experts are wrong, and they find like people who believe that, who fall for conspiracy theories regarding whatever, Bill Gates and whatnot. But like, we might in the front end ridicule this a little bit, and obviously some of these phenomena are ridiculous, but the underlying issue is the lack of trust, and that is like between people and their government, between people and companies. So is the struggle really like is the question, or also the most striking ethical question, one of trust? So how to establish trust with digital means, but also with digital means that play into real life, as we call it, because obviously trust is something very interpersonal.
Yeah, well, definitely. And if anything in ethics has changed in millennial history, has been the raising big issue of trust. And just to be clear, when I was a student in the textbook on Introduction to Ethics for Beginners, trust wasn't even in the keywords, alone being a chapter. Today is the chapter that we need to write. Now, let me just attempt a slight note of optimism here. I think in the past we had a lot of faith. We had faith in some institutions, the king, the queen, the dictator, or even the parliament, or someone powerful. So, faith is not something that you necessarily have rationally. I mean, it's a belief. You just delegate, or someone will take care of this. So, trust is something that needs to be earned, is acquired for a good reason. It can be removed if that sort of good reason is no longer there. Someone does something, say, for me, I can see what they're doing, transparency, they're accountable. There you go. I may actually have trust in those people. So if you like to describe this a bit historically on a big brush, we are moving from an age of faith to an age of trust. Trust is difficult to handle. As a very mature society, we are becoming mature. So in a way, as I said, it's a bit of an optimistic view, but not so much. The pain we are feeling now in terms of lack of trust is good pain. It's pain of someone that is growing to be a mature society where trust is given and removed for good reasons. But that requires education, information, good mass media, good politics, a lot of other conditions. Are we getting there? I hope so. I very much hope so. And I hope that this pain of growth will lead to a better society.
Thank you. We have two questions here that in the end that I would like to combine, because I feel one builds sort of on the other, at least in terms of answer. So Annalena asks, how can we ensure transparency to both the state as well as to private intermediaries such as Apple and Google? And Enrico Panay asks, what kind of regulation should we take after the pandemic to be ready for the next ethical problems? So maybe you can just wind these two up and answer. Yeah.
Yeah, so transparency is comes with, I said, is one of the conditions that enable. One leg is you do something, an activity. Then you have transparency about the activity and accountability for that activity. So I do something, you can see that I'm doing what I'm doing, and if something goes wrong, it's my fault, etc. How do we sort of establish transparency? Well, you can either establish transparency by law, required, and therefore there's a big stick at the end of it if you don't do it, or you can, or is inclusive, or you can leverage market forces. You make transparency someone else's business. For example, you support NGOs that they go after some agents and try to check whether they are transparent or not. It is their interest, a third-party interest, to make sure that someone else is transparent. In fact, I could even have a financial interest. The more transparency I get, the better my NGO develops. Of course, I'm not non-profit, but I can hire more people, etc. So these two forces, the legal requirement and the market force, can go and work together. What do we need? Good design. a good design of these couple of rules, the legal and the market-oriented, so that transparency is implemented. What we cannot expect, and what will be a delusion, is that transparency comes by default. It's like trust. It must be designed. It must be implemented. There is no trust to begin with, not at what. And there is no transparency just in case. So I am optimistic about the opportunity to design a framework that makes transparency more a normality than anything else.
Thank you very much, Luciano. It's always a delight to talk to you and to wander over these passages of our digital reality and the meadow of ethical considerations. So thanks to you again. Thanks to the Vodafone Institute. Thanks to Inga. Thanks to you guys for hosting us. Thanks to the community for tuning in and asking questions, listening to this debate. This will be online, and you can find this on the Vodafone Institute's Facebook page, for instance. And thank you from my end too to tuning in, and you all have a wonderful evening, day, or morning, or night, wherever in the world you are watching this. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone. Ciao.